Hello and welcome everybody. We'll just wait a few seconds just for everybody to appear in the room and hopefully we will kick off momentarily. Okay, I think that we're about settled with numbers. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. We're glad to have you all here for our third webinar in the series with the Intensive Care Society. My name is Dr. Matt Sawyer and I'm a GP and I run a sustainability consultancy looking at all things carbon, including doing carbon literacy training for healthcare staff. Today's session will touch on carbon footprinting. We'll take an in-depth look at food production, sustainable diets and what we can do to shift our thinking when it comes to what we consume. We will have one pre-recorded talk by Dr. Fintan Hughes to begin with, followed by a joint presentation by Kirsten Bash and Professor Tim Lang, two great speakers, both of whom are experts in their fields. Some general housekeeping to start. At the bottom of the screen, you'll notice the Q&A box. After today's talks, our speakers will be more than happy to answer any of your questions. Please just put them in the box and we'll direct them to the correct presenter during our Q&A session. Unfortunately, Dr. Hughes is unable to join us live today, so he won't be able to answer the questions for us, but you're welcome to drop anything you'd like to know more about into the Q&A box and we'll come back to it at a later date. So, without any more preamble, we'll start today's session with a pre-recorded talk from Dr. Fintan Hughes. Fintan is an Irish physician who previously studied at Trinity College in Dublin. He's now completing an anaesthesia residency at Duke University Medical Centre and researching the healthcare industry's potential role in decarbonising energy production. Please turn up your volume if you're finding it a bit quiet. And now, Fintan's presentation. Hopefully. I think we've got the Fintan's presentation ready to go.
Good morning, and thanks very much for joining this Intensive Care Society webinar. My name is Fintan Hughes. I'm an anaesthesiology resident at Duke University, where I'm currently leading our decarbonisation efforts. And last year, I ran a project which drew together some really brilliant thinkers in the climate change and healthcare spaces. Some economists, energy industry leaders, politicians, all with the aim of identifying the key actions that medics can take to have the largest impact in reducing their emissions. Climate change is a pretty overwhelming problem. It's one that seems far too large to be fixed by just us alone as medics. But when we realise the true medical implications of climate change at a planetary health level, essentially what it means in terms of what we're going to see coming through the doors of our hospital in years to come, it really forces us to reimagine our duty of care and extend our focus to all the populations that are affected by climate change, recognising our duty of care as medics to really take on climate action. The problem is large, but it has solutions. And the required technology actually exists already and is all economically viable. It's simply the adoption of these solutions that is the issue, and that's something that can and should be led by medics. After the last year and a half of the pandemic, medics have become even more trusted and valued members of societies. And it's from this position that we can really start to lead. So let me show you how that can work. We can lead by examples. We can lead society with simple, clear health messages. We can lead industry to achieving true net zero emissions with us. And we can lead the markets by directing a decarbonisation of the economy towards a more healthy future. As we lead in this area, it's something that's essential that we do together. We have to move together because there's strength in numbers. There's 60 million healthcare workers worldwide, controlling about 10% of the GDP of the global economy. And if 1% of the population and 8 or 10% of the global economy all shift together, then this is an extremely powerful signal, both to society and also to business markets. Hedge funds will recognize that 8% of the world's money has moved all at once out of fossil fuels and into renewables, and global investments will move accordingly. So we can look a little bit at what we can do as individuals to make this move start to happen. We can shift our energy to 100% clean energy. eliminating the use of all fossil fuels. This is something we can do in our personal lives and also up throughout our healthcare systems, and something that, as leaders in this field, we can very much champion throughout our institutions. We can shift our own money and the money of the institutions that we work within and work for, directing those investments towards low carbon alternatives, low carbon reinvestment, essentially. And then we can shift our food sources so that we will restore natural land in order for it to draw down carbon effectively. In this area, the term carbon footprint often comes up, and that refers essentially to the total emissions that is caused by a person or an event or an activity. And it's a very useful tool, but it's worth bearing in mind the history of the carbon footprint. It's the result of a $250 million advertising campaign run by BP in the early 2000s, with the sole focus of shifting blame onto the individual and away from the source of those emissions. Carbon footprints are useful as a thought experiment to demonstrate where the areas of action are in our lives. And it can be very useful as an educational piece, but only to be used within the context of what it is. It's part of a large advertising campaign that the fossil fuel industry have run to try to deflect attention away from their activities. You'll hear about food from somebody far more qualified than me in just a few minutes, but the fundamentals in my mind are that food production takes up 40% of the Earth's land surface, accounts for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, and uses 70% of our fresh water. Our food system is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss and deforestation, and that is happening in the context of us being in the fastest mass extinction ever, by a factor of about 10,000 times, with over 60% of all vertebrates having been lost since 1970. And of course, it doesn't need to be dwelled too much on the increased risk of zoonotic diseases that come from expanding farmlands. The one-liner action for me in terms of how to most effectively reduce the impact of our food system is to move to lower carbon intensity protein sources. So where you see beef can average 25 kilos of CO2 for 100 grams of protein as a food source, tofu or tempeh can be 1.6 kilos, whereas nuts can often be carbon negative, actually drawing down carbon from the atmosphere while they produce protein. Transport is conceptually easy, but in practice very challenging to improve. While food accounts for 30% of emissions, transport accounts for pretty similar, about 25% of emissions. This includes road travel, medics going to work, ambulances bringing patients around, patients coming to and from clinics, the road freight, every single piece of equipment, drug, boxes of gloves, linen, oxygen tanks, and then aviation with academics flying to conferences that could have been held online, and air freight with pharmacy. There's an enormous scope of emissions that healthcare has that's tied up within transport. A new effort in the meantime is needed to see how we can reduce our reliance on transport intensive activities, transport intensive products and resources, and how we can minimize unnecessary transport while we wait for low carbon alternatives for transport to become widespread. The overall message is to use active transport wherever possible, and where that's not possible, to utilize low emission public transport. And then we need to do whatever we can to minimize unnecessary patient transport, while also pushing for the electrification of hospital vehicles. Energy is the last of the three main groups: food, transport, and energy. Global energy demands are climbing, and while we have added a small slice of renewables into the energy mix over the last 5-10 years, coal still very much prevails globally as the dominant fuel, with fossil-fueled natural gas being the fastest growing electricity source. And we really cannot afford to pull any punches in naming the source of the problem. medical societies, departments of medicine within universities need to explicitly state that the burning of fossil fuels is absolutely catastrophic to human health. That is what is driving all of climate change. And the fossil fuel industry is destroying the very fundamental social and environmental determinants of health. The best news to come out of 2020, arguably even better than the emergence of COVID-19 vaccines, is that energy is now on an equal playing field. So for the first time ever, it's cheaper to build new renewable power generation facilities than it is to continue using existing fossil fuel plants. So if you have an industry that needs power, the cheapest way to power it is to build new renewable infrastructure, not to buy power from existing coal or gas. And that is a fundamental turning point that has happened in the global technology and economic makeup that is yet to be pushed to its full impact. And that is really, in my view, where medicine, healthcare can have its biggest impact. The NHS, for example, spends £500 million on electricity every year. That equates to an energy demand of about 1,000 megawatts. That 1,000 megawatt energy demand, were it financed by a private power purchasing agreement, would bring about the creation of one of the largest wind farms in Europe, which would be a massive public image branded as a health intervention. And this is an example of potentially multiplicative action. We would see a reduction in the emissions of the NHS. It would fund the generation, crucially, of new renewable capacity. There's very clear branding then associating health and renewable power. It crucially denies revenue that otherwise would have gone to fossil fuel industries, sets an example for what a health system can do, which, if replicated across the international health systems, even across the entire healthcare industry, across pharmaceuticals, medtech, and the health insurance industry, would not only save money along the way, but send an extremely powerful signal to the global markets that healthcare en masse is getting out of fossil fuels all at once. As fossil fuel demand drops, this turns existing fossil fuel investments into stranded assets, and investment moves more and more from fossil fuel development into renewable energy expansion. Fossil fuel industry collapses, and the global economy transitions into a healthy, decarbonized economy. The major polluters of the world that are profiting from the destruction of the social environmental determinants of health have an incredible economic might, and this makes them almost untouchable. The fossil fuel industry is worth $2.1 trillion annually across the world. I genuinely think that the only force that's actually capable of stopping that is healthcare, because annually the global healthcare industry is worth $8.3 billion annually. So that is over 4 times that of the economic might of the fossil fuel industry. So healthcare has both the motivation and the means to stop this. The unfortunate reality of the Anthropocene is that climate action is the single most effective global health intervention that we can take. As the educated elite in positions of trust in society, it is essentially our duty of care to drive this action. We can lead by example by leveraging our economic might and social influence. We're 1% of the world's population and, as you said before, control 10% of GDP. So the economic impact of all of this force moving together will drive investment from polluting industries towards low carbon industries. And by transitioning this economic engine of healthcare to an exclusively low carbon economy, will create a massive shift in international energy markets and the food industry, across transportation, and accelerate the decarbonization of the global economy. So with that vision, where do we actually start, and what do you do today? Eat smart, which means more plants, less waste, following the planetary health diet, which you'll hear about shortly. Using active transport wherever possible, advocating for non-polluting transport, and being mindful of where transport is driving emissions in your sector. Switching to 100% renewable domestic energy suppliers, electrifying your heating, and pushing this as a movement that happens across both colleagues in healthcare and then across healthcare institutions. Lead initiatives to divest organizations from fossil fuels and reinvest those funds into low carbon industries. Be aware of your bank's fossil fuel financing. Go to banktrack.org to find out more about how your bank could theoretically be funding the expansion of fossil fuels, and speak out loudly against any fossil fuel proliferation. The fossilfueltreaty.org is a useful resource for that. And then tell your colleagues what you've done and tell them why. And require each of these actions to be taken by any commercial partners or suppliers that we deal with going forwards.
Thank you very much to Fintan for that excellent and very thought-provoking presentation. It's a real shame that he can't join us this afternoon. I'd like to now hand over to Kristin Bash and Professor Tim Lang, who are going to talk to us about the impact of food production on the environment and what we can do to change our thinking to solve the environmental problem of food. Kristin is a public health consultant with expertise in the overlap of public health, food systems, health inequalities, population diets, and the environment. She's chair of the Food Special Interest Group for the Faculty of Public Health, and since 2017 has also been an honorary lecturer at public health at the School of Health and Related Research at the University of Sheffield. To top all of that off, she's also completing a PhD related to sustainable diets for the Grantham Centre of Sustainable Futures. Off script, I think that if I was going to put somebody in charge of the government looking after food policy, I think you're it. So Tim has been Professor of Food Policy at City University London's Centre for Food Policy since 2002, where he and the centre work closely with the scientific and civil society organisations, particularly through food research collaboration. He's been involved in public and academic research and debate about food policy for the past 38 years, including as an advisor to many bodies from the European Commission to the Environment to the Mayor of London. He was Commissioner on the UK Government's Sustainable Development Commission from 2006 to 2011 and has written several books on food policy. So over to the two of you. Thank you.
Hi, I am going to kick us off. I will share my screen now. If we're able to see that. So today, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be here today. I love to speak about food, I think it's fair to say. It's a true love of mine. I am a public health consultant by profession, and I'm going to turn my video off so that I can. There we are. So yes, I'm here to talk today about reducing the impact of climate change and specifically around the food system. And Professor Lang and I are doing a double act, if you will. And so the format will generally be I'm setting up the problem and he will come along and tell us how we can resolve everything. So no small, yes, no small pressure there. So as I said, I like to talk about food, so just as a very quick sort of context, right? And speaking of food, there's 50,000 edible plant species in the world, but we only eat a few hundred of these in any great variety. And in fact, that's an entirely separate lecture, but the variety that we're eating is shrinking, right? Our diets are becoming exceedingly homogenized globally. But only about 15% of these 50,000 edible plant species make up 90% of our world's energy intake. And of that 90%, 2/3 of that is only 3 crops. So we have maize, rice, and wheat. So just in thinking about that and what that means as we go through the rest of our talk as a bit of context. And we require a lot of food. There are a lot of us to feed. And when I first put this particular slide together, I know we're all familiar with population growth as an issue, but it did surprise me seeing it as a visual that it took 140 years for our population to double in size between 1800 and 1940, and only 60 years to then triple from that level. We may be slowing down a bit as a result of the pandemic, but estimates have been that we're pushing towards 9.5 billion by 2050. So there are quite a few people to feed. And not going too much into history with Professor Lang on the call, but 1940, World War II, the focus was very clearly on the concern around hunger and malnutrition. So there was the Hot Springs Conference in Virginia in World War II, and they came up with the concept of freedom from want. And freedom from want in a food system meant that we would have a secure food system, we'd have access to it, we'd have an adequate food system or enough to eat, and it would be suitable or nutritionally diverse. But what we really focused on was just that second bit, just having enough to eat. And so that led us to really focus on just producing a lot of food. And we did this. It's a huge success story of the 20th century. So as you can see, between 1960 and 2018, over 200% growth in cereal production. And we did this through developing what we now recognize as the industrial food system. So increasing tremendously amount of inputs, so nitrogen and phosphorus-based fertilizers, pesticides and herbicides. We automated and used carbon fuel-driven machinery, selective crop breeding. So all of this went into increasing our food system and the tremendous success that went with that. But what, sorry, I forgot I put this slide in there. So the other thing to keep in mind is then as countries grew, as GDP grew, and this is often known as the dietary transition, our dietary patterns changed. So on the left, you see meat protein, and that will come back into discussion later on, so to keep an eye on that. But also refined sugars, so that's our processed foods. And notably, the success story from the 40s, what the aim was, is we did increase the amount of calories that were eaten as GDP grew, and this is a story across the globe. But not all was positive, right? So coming back to a UK focus, and this is true globally, is that our food system is not fit for purpose in terms of our health. I'm not focusing too much on that in this talk, but we know the risks on obesity. So just from a UK perspective, 2/3 of adults are obese, overweight or obese at this point in time. 20% of our year, 20% overall of our year 6 children are obese. And I'd be a remiss public health professional if I didn't comment on the inequality. So it's double the amount of obesity in our most deprived as our least deprived. And there are a number of other health issues. And again, there's so much to dig into here, but just as the biggest, the overall picture is that our dietary quality is the key, is neck and neck with tobacco. Tobacco is a #1 modifiable risk factor in our behavior. And then putting health aside for a moment, just in terms of our environment, right? So back to 2011 in the Foresight report, we knew that in terms of sustainability, the food system meets the absolute definition for being unsustainable. The way we're producing our food globally is basically risking our planet's ability to produce food for us in the future. So not only climate change, the environment and biodiversity, but just that pure unsustainable nature of our food system. And then here's something just for some context, right? So we hear a lot about livestock, we hear a lot about meat and animal products, and what is the issue? So animal welfare is very important to me, but let's put that aside for a moment. Let's pretend animals are just food machines, if we will do that. We saw the increase that we needed in our population who we need to feed. Animals are inefficient food machines, generally speaking, and this is a lot with feed. But when you use feed, we'll take cows, we'll take beef cattle. And there's some variation here. So for example, if you feed 100 calories to a beef cow, you'll get 1.9 calories back out. I've seen that up to 3, 4, but it's quite low. It's lower than you'd think it might be. In terms of protein, so beef is a good protein source, but if you feed 100 grams of protein to a cow, you're maybe getting, there's 4, I've seen that up to 7 or 8 grams of protein back out. So at the end of the day, and with everything else put aside, just to keep that in your mind as we go through the rest of the discussion, is that they're just inefficient at making food. In addition to being sentient animals, that's, just in terms of efficiency and what we need to do in terms of feeding our population. And very briefly, I'm getting to climate change, but environmental impacts, only, everything, water, 2% of the water in the globe is useful for humans. We use 70% of that for agriculture. About a third of that is used for livestock. We don't think of soil as a resource, but it is absolutely a resource. So every mineral you get out of your food originally comes from the soil and from the greens that grow from the soil. So much so that when cows are not fed a grass-fed diet, right, when they're fed commercial food, they need to be supplemented with calcium, because the calcium would normally come through the greens that got it from the soil. So our soil is a resource, and it's being depleted at 10 to 100 times the rate it's able to regenerate itself, with industrial farming methods at the far end of that. Algae blooms, eutrophication from nitrogen runoffs. I just heard on Radio 4 about the bird population that's dying. They're starving, and I think it may be from toxins from algae blooms, which is quite shocking. So quite a few environmental impacts. And again, very quickly to talk about antimicrobial use, 73% of antibiotics globally are used for agriculture, mostly used to promote growth and prevent disease. Sorry, animal agriculture, says livestock. And intensive livestock is dependent on antibiotics because of the way that animals are raised. They need to have prophylaxis antibiotic use. So it's another sort of really scary side effect of industrial farming, because as we know, when microbes crop up in one place, they go global. Today we're here to talk about climate change. So get to it. I won't talk too much about climate change, where I think everyone on this call is probably quite familiar with the risks and the where we're headed with this. But in terms of our food, so this was touched on in the previous talk a bit, but we know estimates range. So you see 24 to 28%. It's around a quarter of our food. A quarter of greenhouse gas emissions come from our food sources. About 60% of that comes from animal products, and about half comes from beef and lambs. These are what we call ruminant animals, or animals that eat grass, tend to emit the most, or be responsible rather, for the most greenhouse gas emissions or carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. And here's a variety. There's this Poor and Nemesic 2008 paper, and if we haven't shared the link, I think we will, because it's quite a good seminal reference paper if you're interested in this topic. And what you see here is the range of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions across a range of food types. You'll see a pattern form where you have animal products sort of clumped towards the top of that list and plant-based products at the bottom. You'll also see in this brown section, this is the farm, the carbon dioxide emissions that are produced at farm level. So that little tiny red sliver is transportation. So eating local is a really important part of the equation, right? We don't want to increase carbon emissions more than we need to, but it's really the food itself and what it's creating in its production stage, if you want to call it that, and the farm stage. And you can see that beef is quite a lot higher than others, which is why it gets the press that you've seen. There's a lot of evidence to support why that is. In terms of land, this was also touched on earlier, but 40% of all land is used for food. 77% of that is used by livestock, but it's only creating 37% of our protein and 18% of our calories. So there's a mismatch between how much land we're using generally and how much of our nutrients are being produced. That's a Cerrado in Brazil at the bottom. An area the size of London, I think, is destroyed every 3 weeks, particularly when they were leaving the rainforest alone pre-Bolsonaro. So I think they're back to the rainforest now, but it's quite shocking how much land is used and destroyed. It's desperately sad, in fact. And this is this is about what we're importing. So when we talk about greenhouse gas emissions and we look at the net zero targets that we have set, what we need to look at is not only what we're producing in country. So you saw that figure before, about 26% of all greenhouse gas emissions are produced by agriculture. Within the UK, it's only about 10%, but that's what we're producing in country. We need to be responsible for, and we need to be addressing what we are consuming, not necessarily what we're producing. And the reason for that is, just like with antimicrobial resistance, and as we know, it doesn't matter where in the world greenhouse gas emissions are created, they're affecting everyone. Food waste has been brought up. The statistic to keep in mind is if food waste were a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter. A third of all food produced is wasted, and we do our fair share here in the UK with 7 million tons of food wasted every year. I won't go through this in too much detail, but there's quite a lot of evidence around the climate change impacts that are related specifically to agriculture. So this is around things like changing weather patterns and precipitation patterns, rainfall, and flooding and droughts, and crop yield sensitivities to temperature and water. But it's also about pests. And when pests, be these weeds or insects, when they change latitude, they often migrate out of areas where they have natural predators. And this means that they become quite invasive, and it's very destructive to crops. So it's a real impact. Pollinators, impacts on labor, with temperatures just getting too high for much of the world, where physical or humans have to go out and grow food. They're not physically able to work in the heat, as well as conflict. So just to keep in mind, when we're thinking about climate change, there are tremendous impacts on agriculture. This is a map of where there are potential decreases in crop yields. You'll see the global south again bearing the brunt most generally. this caught my attention when I first, it's a few years back now, but this is about the effect of excess carbon dioxide on crops. So plants eat carbon dioxide, to go back to basics. And I say this often, but when I eat too much, I'm not creating more brain cells or muscle tissue. And plants aren't creating more of the good stuff either. They're creating more sugar, so that the nutrient density of these crops is reducing when they're being grown in higher concentrations of carbon dioxide and equivalent. So it's quite frightening in that respect if you go back to the beginning and how much of our food system is based on this. I'm getting towards the end, but this is, again, that paper, but what you see here is when you talk about methods of growing, so we hear a lot about different, there are really good agroecological methods, farming methods, and we definitely want to encourage those. They're on the lower end of environmental degradation. They can be beneficial to landscapes, particularly when the right land is used. But we just talk about production. So going back to beef, there's more than a tenfold difference between the most and least carbon emitting methods. But even the least carbon emitting beef is more than 10 times plus the carbon emissions of many other protein foods, and particularly plant protein foods. And so this is it's just when you talk about picking meat and animal products that are more sustainably raised, it's important, but it's not as important as the type of food in the overall picture. The good news is that there are co-benefits. I think you may have had the last webinar may have touched on some of the co-benefits a bit, but here we have quite a good study that this is modeling. So it's modeling a combination of environmental impacts against health outcomes, and particularly relative risk of mortality. And we see, again, that pattern of particularly red and processed meat have the highest health impacts, but they also have quite high environmental impacts. So there are multiple benefits. And I'm not speaking too much on those today, but that is a very interesting aspect of the discussion. And finally, just to talk about, and then to hand over to Tim, is when we're looking at having influence, we saw that there's a tenfold difference in the way we're growing food. So it's the production side, and we very much want to focus on that. But on the demand side, on what we're eating as a population, we need to influence behavior. And here's a simple model that I often use in talks, but a more detailed model, right? So these are different levels of what influences our decisions as individuals and populations to eat. Most, and I feel very strongly about this as a public health person, but most interventions focus on the individual level, which is important, but putting aside people's variation in their ability to respond to those interventions, it's ignoring all of these other layers of influence on what we eat. And those influences together are overpowering to individual influences when the intervention is only aimed at that level. It needs to go across these influences, at least target multiple levels of these influences, if it's to truly and effectively target our dietary behavior as a population and to make real change. And so that is my, oops, apologies. There we are. And that concludes me. I'm very, very happy to hand over to Professor Lang to pick up how we will fix this problem. Over to you, Tim.
Okay, Kristen, thank you very much. And although he's, I hope, safely in bed at Duke University, I'm hoping that I can sort of go a bit further. I'm trying to share my screen. I'll have one more go, and then we'll go to I'm still on Kristen. Kristen, have you unshared?
I have, yes, Tim.
That's I don't know why it's saying that on mine. It's saying, are the ICS people there? Is Eleanor or anyone there? We've got a fallback, which is you've got my slides in case such things happen. It's not. Yeah, there you go. Okay, good job. We've thought ahead. Would you flick to slide 11? Just in case Kristen couldn't come or something, she's done much better and more elegantly than I. So the first 10 slides of mine were basically very quick overview, and she's given a better one. But my task was really to focus on this. Next slide, please. And I'm trying to think about you people, not least because about 10 meters behind my back is my wife, who just broke her ankle exactly a week ago, and not exactly you people, but sort of care people have sorted her out, and she's now got months to try and rebuild her ankle. So I've been thinking quite practically. I'm a professor of food policy. I've worked on this for 45 years. And here are my 10 thoughts. The first is, well, both Fintan and Kristin have shown this, we've got to get real about the UK food system. I am fed up with hearing people saying, oh, well, it's all the problems of food or all Africa or Asia. Actually, we're the problem, which bounces onto them. They have a problem, but we are the problem. Food is our problem, and now it's not a future issue. And a country like Britain is in uncharted waters, not least, dare I say it, because of Brexit. For 50 years, we've webbed our food system in with what was 28 countries, now it's 27. And about, depends how you calculate it, 30% at least, some would argue it's more like 40% of our food comes from the EU, which is not us. And mostly it's the good stuff. It's fruit and vegetables, actually, that we import. And mostly we export whiskey and biscuits. Actually, if I was to do a trade analysis for you, it's we import good stuff and we mostly export not so good stuff from a health perspective. And we've got a real problem in Britain because our food policy is all over the place. The banking crisis in 2007-8, where world commodity prices and food prices and oil, in other words, doubled in 6 months. This shook the rich world absolutely rigid. I was heavily involved in government at the time. I was an advisor on all sorts of fronts. And I know it happened right to the top with prime ministers, G7, G8, etc. And Britain began a very interesting process, actually, frankly, the best process since entering the EU. And for 3 years, there was a rapid rethink with government acting as government for once and beginning to say, here's the evidence, here are the data, here's what we've got to do, and bashing heads together and having its head bashed around, etc. I shouldn't say that to ICS people, but you know what I mean. Intellectually, they were all got onto the same page by 2010, and we had a strategy, and then the government fell, and the new government came in and literally swept it away within 3 months. It was shocking to see for people like me. So for 11 years, we've had nothing. But now a little bit of a process is beginning. A national food strategy has emerged in July this year. I have some criticisms. In fact, later this afternoon, I'm going to be giving a big talk about that. And I can send it to people if you want it in writing. But essentially, a process is going on, which people like you need to know about. There's going to be a white paper on food policy. This is England, not Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. It's England, but England dwarfs in terms of power and responsibility the other parts of the UK. In a white paper by January next year, we hope, and then a food act. So now is a time for everyone with the kind of perspective Fintan and Kristin and I share, that I'm sure you would want to share too. Now's the time to get involved, because the last bullet point, the food system is in crisis, and it's not out there, it's here. Next slide, please. So get real about the UK. The second is a big intellectual shift. Kristin alluded to this in the post-Second World War reconstruction of the world's food, mostly done through the UN, that applied in the Soviet Union and indeed in the West. In China, slightly different, but essentially an intensification of the food system emerged because the public health arguments of the 30s won the argument in the 30s and 40s. And the model was, if we intensify farming, we'll make food more plentiful, make it cheaper, and therefore resolve the problem of hunger related to inadequacy and unaffordability. That was a very seductive, very powerful, evidence-based policy in the time. Within 20 years after World War II, it began to unravel. There's been a bit of nudging and tweaking and shaking, some quite significant in some parts of the world, but not fundamentally. It's been about more, cheaper, intensify, all those figures Kristin gave you about deforestation and carbon emissions that Fintan gave you, etc., they all follow from the intensification post Second World War. Now, the model and the evidence from science, Kristin again has shown it very elegantly, is it's what I call an omni problem. It's not just about nutrients and price, it's about nutrients, biodiversity, water, soil, inequalities in societies, culture, demand, taste, religion, gender. We know it's a complicated issue. And that doesn't yet have a policy framework. And literally next week, the UN Food Systems Summit, which many of us have worked for decades to try and get such a thing, is now truncated to one day. It's ludicrous, if I may be private and frank about it. But the argument that food is a multi-criteria problem or an omni problem has now won the day, but it's not translated into policy. Next slide, please. What we also need, and both Fintan and Kristin hinted at this, is to get real about not just saying, oh, well, leave it to consumers. We've got to do this. Model graphic on the right is one of my favorites, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, an intervention ladder they developed. At the bottom, you say there's a problem, but you do nothing about it, or you monitor it. Going up the ladder to the top where you give people no choice but to do the right thing. I won't go into that, but this is basically what I work on, and not enough people do work on it, how different interventions have different impacts. And what we're realizing, and you people in intensive care know that only too well, you can't sort of faff around at the edges when you're dealing with an intensive care crisis. You got to get stuck in and do the right thing and do triage and do all the things you're trained in. Well, it's becoming the same in food, public health and ecology, actually. And we need a whole range of things. And I spent nearly 4 years of my life on this report, the Eat Lancet report, and I was the policy lead on it. And it's highly cited for very good reasons. And I steered through that we've actually got to, you can't tell the Chinese government what to do. You can't even tell the British government what to do. It's away with the fairies, if I'm frank, on lots of fronts. But you've got to actually get stuck in different ways in different parts of the world. But we've got to realize that it's a great food transformation or bust. Next slide, please. There is a lot of talk in my world and possibly in your world, certainly Kristin's world and mine, about tipping points. Are we at a tipping point on climate change? I actually have been a skeptic about tipping points as a metaphor, but I'm beginning to think maybe it's right. When you see the great acceleration sort of graphics, and Kristin showed one at one point, it's possible that that's the case. So it may be that we are going to recognize really urgent action. We certainly know, my point 4, is that evidence on its own is insufficient for change. If I hear people say to me, oh, well, just present the evidence to government or companies and they'll act, get real. It's not what happens. We know that the complications of contingencies, of vested interests, of default positions dominate, also attention span of politicians, and so on. It's not good enough just to say, well, the evidence leads to action. It doesn't. We've got to get more realistic about policy mechanisms and policy strategies. Next one, please. Next slide. My 5th point is, and you don't know me, or Kristin does, and maybe some of you do, but I've been known all my working life as a critic of the food industry. I am. I think that's what we academics have to be. I was a farmer at one stage in my life for 7 years or so, but I now recognize very well in the last 20 years that there are people in industry who see the world not that far away from what we do. Some are developing products to try and capitalize on it, but basically we've got to actually help supply chains in industry change very fast indeed. And that is partly an issue of the second bullet point here. We've got to recognize that we've got to stop the rise of what we call ultra processed foods which are basically full of fat, salt and sugar. unnecessarily processed foods, taking simple, good ingredients and turning them into basically junk food. Now, the good news here in Britain is one of the good things out of the National Food Strategy document that came out in July this year, led by a very nice guy, Henry Dimbleby, was that he really identified we've got to end the lock-in to junk foods. Well, that's easy to say when you go to the recommendations, and I'm not saying this behind his back, I get on well with him, and I've said, look, your recommendations aren't actually following the analysis. But we've got to do that. We've got to actually have a more unified voice from public health people to say we've got to get off junk food. We've got, if you want a burger, it's maybe all this sort of stuff in that graphic at the top right, maybe once a month, something like that. You know, get a bit more specific than just being moralistic about junk food, and actually help people off the cycle. We need sustainable diet guidelines. The Food Standards Agency in Britain only produces a nutrient-based guidelines. That's pathetic, frankly. If I'm meeting the chief exec and the new chair of it, both of whom I know, next week. I'm fairly trenchant in what I say to them. They need help to be able to get the food supply chains to shift. Next one. You can look at all of these slides later. Next slide, please. Point 6. Big changes are upon us because of Brexit. At the same time as the climate change and the obesity and the nutrition transition and the rise of ultra-processed foods, we've got Brexit. All the good stuff comes in through, look at the map on the left. These are from my book, Feeding Britain, if you want to look at this. That particular graphic is from an exit report by the Institute for Government. Essentially, food comes in at Dover in the Channel Tunnel, and a certain amount goes through Holyhead, Anglesey. I have family, and goes to Northern Ireland and indeed to Dublin and to the Republic. There's a great big sucking sound, actually, that comes on. All of that has been disrupted by Brexit. No thinking, no planning, minimal stuff. There's a real politics of Brexit to this. But think about those trucks that are belting up and down. Now, one of Kristin's slides rightly points out the mode of transport is small compared to land use change, or whether it's beef that's on the land or you're growing vegetables on the land. Those things are very important, but at the same time, those trucks represent power. They may not represent carbon, they do emit carbon, but they're about power. They're about a highly concentrated food system. 9 retailers sell 95% of all the food in Britain. 9 retailers. And those are the trucks. They have regional distribution centers that are belting up and down and then get out to theirs. So if you want to be a farmer or a producer or a small manufacturer to feed to them, you have to have a truck to go to one of their 12 or 15 stores. So those motorways that go over grade 1 land are all part of the power of a hypermarket economy. Next slide, please. And we go to work to buy a car to go to a supermarket to get it. This is ludicrous. We've got to shorten those chains. 7, we've got to demand active leadership and governance. I'm trying to make that clear. You can read these later. These are what I do in my daily life now, even though I'm technically retired. As an emeritus, I try to do my bit. Let me just draw your eyes as ICS people to the bottom. In 2004, after a lorry driver's strike, which held up milk supplies, those of you might remember it, a Civil Contingencies Act came in, which said we have to prepare for such difficulty. This was the government. And resilience forums were set up, which was supposed to include food. In COVID, they were shown not to be working. And I speak in confidence now. I'm an advisor to the London Mayor of London, and was to Boris Johnson when he was too. We worked very hard to get the Civil Contingencies Forum of London to begin to map the food system of London in order to be able to know what do we do in emergencies. We could not get the data to be able to do that. There was no capacity to do that sort of planning. So the law, that white paper from Dimbleby's National Food Strategy comes out in January, ought to be addressing real gearing up of things like mechanisms like civil contingencies fora, fiscal measures. Read all of those. There are lots of things that we keep asking government to do, indeed calling upon them with alliances to do so. Next slide, please. I'm nearly done. Kristen and Fintan said this, it's obvious, champion food change as public health movement. ICS, don't do it on your own. You must do it with others. The Royal the Academy of Royal Medical Colleges, critical mechanism. Kristen and I, both fellows of the Faculty of Public Health, we're trying to build up the faculty in that and working with others. We've got to do it, and we have a way of doing it. Read those checkpoints. Next point, next slide, please. A big speech I'm giving, bizarrely, in Windsor Castle tomorrow night is actually facing this. I've spent a lot of my working life working with and close to the consumer movements of the world. I now am arguing that consumers as a mass are the elephants in the policy room. Unless we engage with consumers, don't hector them, don't demonize them, don't victimize them, but engage with them, we won't get anywhere. And they've got to be helped to do all of these bullet points. They need, for example, in the middle, the mayor of Paris is aiming for a 15-minute city, saying, why should I go? I live in South London. Why should I have to go 2 miles to a hypermarket? How can we get the mechanism so that I walk to my supermarket or walk to my shop or bicycle to it? The 15-minute city is a very interesting notion now floating around town planning. So zones of where we live becomes as important a leverage to help consumers change as thinking about prices and costs and so on. You can look at these as well. And I do a lot of thinking and working with organizations. 6 select committees got together last year and held an unprecedented, what was called a climate assembly. I've put the reference there in the middle. An astonishing experience to have, where people like me and you, Kristen, were advising these randomly chosen people, and they came up with a very radical strategy. My understanding, all my academic training and studies show that when you bring people in, they say, wow, we've got to do things differently. And at the moment, they're just left as observers, voyeurs of this car crash. We've got to stop that very fast indeed. My 10th point is a very simple one. Next one, please. You got to do whatever you can do. We can all do a little bit of some of these very big things that I've put in my slides, but whatever it is, do a little bit. But keep going. That's it. Thank you. Over to you.
Wow. I suspect that many people are feeling a bit like myself, that was a huge amount of ground covered by our 2 speakers. And I'd really just like to thank them both for their really insightful presentation and comments. That was excellent. And the passion really comes across, I think, that you know, where we are at the moment. And I feel some of the frustration that you've got as how we're not where we could be, should be, having known everything, not known everything, but known a lot of stuff for, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 decades. So if people have got questions, please add them to, got 100. So please add them to the chat. Just on a note, so I'm a GP. Every time I speak to my patients about anything to do with diet or health or gastrointestinal anything, I always show them the Eat Lancet plate. I think that is one of the ways to sort of say, look, this is how much fruit and veg you actually need. I say to them, you need at least a piece of fruit and veg with every single meal that you eat. Yeah, and okay. Just as so my lunch today is one of these things. I bought it because I didn't know what it was. This is a custard apple. And so because there isn't a question from somebody else, I'm going to ask about my custard apple. So we've seen that we don't actually eat that many different plant species. So 2 things. First of all, should I worry about the transport of this? Because this is obviously grown overseas. I'm in North Yorkshire. We don't have many custard apple trees up here. So should I worry about the carbon emissions from transporting it from overseas to here? Or should I accept that there is going to be less variety for the consumer to eat if we only grow things locally? So I didn't know if either of the panelists or both of you had a comment on my lunch.
Kristen, you go first, because I could talk for 10 hours about your custard apple, but I won't. Let Kristen speak.
It looked like an artichoke to me when you first held it up, so I was quite surprised. So it's a continuum, isn't it? It's a continuum of things you can do. So, you know, And it's less of a simple picture than it would be. So for example, buying a hothouse tomato from the UK can potentially contribute a lot more to greenhouse gas emissions than importing one from Spain, ironically. And that's simply because we're, all the electricity and power that would use to contribute to that hothouse that would grow that tomato, correct? So there's that puts in the complexity. When we're talking about taking individual decisions, buying things seasonally, buying things locally is the best option. Across that continuum, though, buying things from the plant side of the spectrum of foods versus the animal and the livestock section is always going to be a lower carbon emission. So from an individual perspective, when we're talking about population level perspective, which is what, this is where my focus is as public health, we look at population health, I know you're trained to look at individual health, but looking across the population, directing people more towards the plant side of the spectrum. And as Tim said, perhaps having that hamburger once a month rather than once a week or once a day, as some people might, that's where the better end of the decision process comes. So I'm intrigued by your lunch, to be honest, because I love food. So I'm very curious to know what that is. However, it's a different picture when you're talking about what you're choosing individually and where you want to fall in that. That's my view, Tim. I don't know where you fall in that.
Yeah, no, that's very good. I'll just add a slightly different dimension to Kristen. Firstly, the fact that you can get the custard apple as opposed to knowing what its carbon footprint or where it comes from is what's interesting. We did at our centre part of a big international EU study trying to trace the ethics, trace the journey that foods had gone through, not just the physical journey, but the moral journey, the social journey. And even on a simple product like bread, we found that bakers ultimately hadn't got a clue where all the ingredients in a big, a white sliced bread factory, hadn't really a clue of exactly what had gone into their foods. They knew the tonnage, they knew whether it worked or not, they knew the price of it, but they didn't know much more about the story of it. And my comment to you, Matt, is the story of that custard apple is what's missing. We don't know whether it was grown by happy farmers who are getting a good price for it, or whether it's exploited child labor. And those things matter actually hugely. Because what happens, and we know this from lots of studies, let alone history, is as supply chains get longer, it's very hard to know what's going on further down. And we also know the longer the supply chains, the less money goes to the primary producer. In my Feeding Britain book, which is a deeply boring penguin book, but in other words, I spent years on it, but I try to put everything that I think and apply a cold, calm, analytical mind to our country, my country, rather than talking about somewhere far away. If we look at the history, we know that in Britain, we spend about £250 billion on food. Farming gets about 9% of that, about 9%. The money is basically a fight out where the gross value added, where the profits go and the money goes and the circulation of capital occurs, is a fight between retailing, manufacturing, and now hospitality. And that's very important. So I want to know where the money goes from your custard apple. And I can tell you it won't go to the producer.
I bought it because I'd never seen one before, and apparently it's meant to taste like an apple.
Enjoy it. Matt, enjoy it. I wish you could set your taste buds.
So there's a question from Jack Massingham. I have transitioned to a vegan diet and really value buying locally. How important is buying organic? Is it truly organic, and will it make a substantial difference?
Well, let me leap in quickly. I was an organic farmer. I'm president of the Organic Gardeners. I'm a very keen gardener. There are 9 million gardeners in Britain, and really we've got to activate them. That's part of the mechanism, I think, for activating consumers. Yes, it does matter. The nutrient content, there's some studies coming out now, which is very welcome, that, organic milk has got some different nutrient profiles than non-organic. But the big impact, the single impact, is that, there is not the same destruction of biodiversity on the land from an organic product as there is from a pesticide using or fungicide using product. That's the big advantage. And in 10 seconds on Radio 1, I just say that's why it's worth eating organic. Is organic the answer to the world's problems? No, It isn't. Come on, I'm an academic. Do I support it? Yes. But it has to have brackets around it. The big issue with vegan diets, let me just say, is where the protein comes from. And the second big issue is soya. Soya is a really problematic crop. So there is a whole argument, again, wherein Kristen and I have a shared interest in this. In our center, we've championed what we call ecological public health, the connection between human health and ecosystems health. One of the reasons people like me argue for a sustainable dietary guidelines to come out of the Food Standards Agency, and it's long overdue and has been resisted, is because we must create an omni-standards approach. That's what I said in my talk. Food is a multi-criteria issue. It's not just organic or nutrients. It's the labor process. It's which nutrients. It's the biodiversity. It's the money flows, and that needs to be got a grip of. And it's only people like us pushing that, frankly, is going to get it. That or crisis. Unfortunately, as I said at the beginning of the Lancet Commission process, when I said, look, we'll end up coming up with some pretty radical recommendations, this stellar group of scientists that I was with said, no, we can't say that, Tim, we can't say that. I said, okay. And then by the end, when we've done all the modeling and shown it, they're wanting to be really programmatic. And I said, whoa, hold on, if someone wants to go vegan, let them go vegan, But the point is, as Kristen said, we've got to steer it in a new framework at population level. And that's got to be ecological public health. Kristen.
The thing I would add to that, so it's a different perspective, which is good, but it's looking at what impact you're having with what you're eating. So there are two issues that are truly global. And so eating organic is not necessarily going to impact, it's not going to have the biggest impact on climate change, for example, but it will have a much larger impact on local issues such as biodiversity loss and soil quality and runoff and all of these types of things. So there are different levels of impact. They're all important. But it's a matter of understanding. And again, it's that continuum. It's where are you influencing, and the risk of what they call the halo effect. So the one thing that I know was pointed out, Tara Garnett, is who I first heard speak about this, really, is that people, for example, vegans are saving a lot of water, for example, because, each hamburger is worth, 20 showers or something in terms of water production. But wearing one hat and then ignoring other, aspects of environmentally sustainable behavior, it can be a trade-off. Recycling versus eating organic, all these types of things. So the risk isn't just doing one thing. It's trying to take a look across that spectrum of ways that we can each individually influence not only our local environments, but also the globe, really, the planetary health of our climate and everything else. I think that's
a good world, Matt, to add to that, a good world would mean that you could quick access to what's known about your custard apple. I don't know where you bought it. If you bought it at a supermarket, they know much of this information, but it's not shared. I'm at the moment up to my neck through an ex-student of mine wheeling me out in trying to argue at the UN Food Systems Summit that we resuscitate really low on that Nuffield ladder of intervention. That why on earth, given the technology, isn't the multi-criteria labeling? Why did it take us 25 years to get quantitative ingredients declaration labeling? Why did it take 20 years to get nutrients put onto a label? Climate change has got to get this information to people very fast indeed, because when it starts coming out, we showed this in a big process with the Consumers Association, which we've shown it in the Climate Assembly. When consumers know, they come to pretty good conclusions, actually. They don't need experts and professors like me to tell them what to do. They see it.
With one caveat, Tim, and I will say this, just looking at, for example, the public health efforts to increase fruit and veg consumption. So when individuals have information, there's a certain portion of the population that they will have the emotional bandwidth, the resources, the wherewithal to be able to do it. There is a continuum. So when we talk about that Nuffield ladder, the top-down approaches are the ones that tend to have the widest impact across the full population and the least risk of being unequal in who picks them up. So it's really important. It's also important then to be used as the basis, for example, for procurement guidance and regulation, so that you can start, and you can provide local government with a basis for their local food strategy and how they'll be developing things. But without that omni label, as Tim's talking about, you can't take those decisions. In terms of an individual impact, you're again talking about individual agency, which does vary. So there is some wiggle room there, but it's a really important first step, because you can't take any of those additional steps without it. So
can I say,
I agree with that.
Thank you both for your answer there. I know that we've run over, but I think that the audience can see the amount of knowledge and enthusiasm and passion. And I suspect that we could probably be here for 24 hours and talk about all sorts of issues. I do apologise for not getting to the question on 15-minute cities. I know that that's in the chat and that there's an answer there. So I'd really like to say thank you to our speakers first and foremost. I'd like to say thank you to the Intensive Care Society, and I'd like to say thank you to the audience for this fantastic session. The next session will be on Tuesday the 28th of September at 12:30, and we'll continue to look at the actions that we can take on a personal level to achieve a positive impact, reduce our carbon footprint, and to reduce biodiversity loss. The next session will look in more detail at energy consumption, transport, resource use, recycling, the good, the bad and the ugly, and how moving to a circular economy will help us with that journey. The Intensive Care Society is also currently recruiting for their sustainability working group, and so if anybody is interested in getting involved, you can find out more on the website, which is www.ics.ac.uk/sustainability, where you can also find out more about future webinar sessions. So I'd like to wrap up today. I'd like to say thank you for one last time, and we'll see you all again next time. Bye for now.